lot on what this means to the individual whose privacy is violated in the most horrible way. But I think what may be even more important is what this means for democracy. Because spyware is not just a technology, it is a tool in a broader toolkit, the toolkit of the authoritarian. It is a grave threat to democracy. Because spyware is not being used against, just any citizen. And this is also why many people think, oh, it doesn't concern me. It concerns only, a handful of people that I have nothing to do with. No, it concerns the very people who are the custodians of our democracy, the people who hold power to account, the people who scrutinize, the people who exercise oversight, journalists, oversight bodies, lawyers, NGOs, researchers, opposition politicians. And I firmly believe that democracy is about checks and balances and accountability and scrutiny. Take those away and democracy is dead. If you have no more countervailing powers, then democracy is dead. And that is the very purpose of the regimes that are using spyware against some of their own citizens. And this is not only happening in Saudi Arabia or Mexico. No, it's happening right here on our doorstep within the European Union by EU governments. It is a democracy crisis, you might say. Now, but let's see a little bit what happened since the news of this broke, which is now almost 2 years ago, July 2021, when the Pegasus project presented its report. Justice has not been done in a single case. Not a single case. No inquiry, be it parliamentary or judicial or police inquiry, has been concluded in a meaningful way. In not a single member state has light been shed on the situation. Not a single case of illicit exports has been investigated and not a single license has been repealed. Colleagues, nothing has been done. Yeah, some countries have taken measures, but in most of the cases they are meaningless or they even make matters worse. And I have to say, the European Union has also been pretty much absent, with the exception of this House and maybe the European Public Prosecutor's Office. Letters have been written to the member states asking them for explanations, but in a very friendly way. Now, I find the contrast with the response of the European Union to other crises quite stark. We've had a war, we've had a pandemic, we had inflation, we had an energy crisis. A bit longer ago, we had the banking crisis. And every time, the European Union is there with a crisis response. In this case, the crisis is a democratic crisis. Democracy is the core of what the European Union is about. And yet, the European Union is absent. Now, today, dear Commissioner, we are, or tomorrow I should say, we are adopting a comprehensive set of recommendations. And I would really ask the Commission to follow up as much as you can. Really seek the limits of your powers. And in any case, report back in great detail to the European Parliament, preferably even before the summer break, about how you intend to give a follow-up to our recommendations, because this is not the end of our work, friends. This is where it starts. Tomorrow we're going to adopt the big sledgehammer that we will be fighting authoritarianism with, and we will make sure that every single recommendation is implemented, no matter how long it takes. Thank you very much.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. Now, on behalf of the Commission, Commissioner Reynders.
Thank you, Madam President. Honourable members, la Commission tient à remercier.
The Commission should like to thank the Pegasus Committee for its report on the presumed use of Pegasus and other surveillance software in the EU. We will study the recommendations adopted by your Parliament, and we will give the due follow-up to that. I'm sure the Council will do the same, even if the Council was not invited for this debate. The Commission has watched the committee's proceedings keenly. Throughout the course of that time,
clear that it condemns any illegal interference in personal communications, as it goes against democratic values and undermines fundamental rights. We expect that national competent authorities and courts make full use of their powers to thoroughly investigate the allegations regarding any unlawful surveillance activities and to restore citizens' trust. Spyware is a particularly intrusive technology. It is paramount that the fundamental rights to privacy and data protection, as enshrined in EU law, are fully respected all over the Union. The legal framework governing the use of spyware can differ depending on whether its use falls under EU law or national law. Comme je l'ai déjà évoqué dans les cas où le droit
As previously stated, where EU law applies, in the case of the use of spyware, confidentiality of any communications of individuals protected by GDPR and the directive on police and justice, as well as on e-communications. Authorities for surveillance and the national authorities are in charge of monitoring this and making sure that this legal framework is fully implemented. EU law in data protection will continue to apply when it comes to the use of personal data by private entities, even if this treatment is necessary for the use of national security. Similarly, EU law applies also when public authorities process any personal data for repressive or penal purposes. In this way, when law enforcement use any type of spyware for this type of objective, the Police Justice Directive applies. In this situation, individuals have the right to make sure that their rights are upheld pursuant to EU law. That includes the right to information, as well as the right to legal redress. The Commission insists on the importance of control authorities, as well as national legal authorities, to have the proper competence in order to enforce just that. It is essential that these authorities fully avail of all of their powers for the purposes of fully and in-depth assessing any violation of rights in this area.
EU law does not apply to cases where public authorities directly access the data, so not via a telecom operator, and process them for genuine national security purposes, which is a different issue than law enforcement. An important question in this debate is therefore the delineation between the application of EU law and national rules on national security, as the PEGA committee has also underlined. It is for the Member States to define their national security interests and to adopt appropriate measures to ensure their national and external security. Nevertheless, the Open Court of Justice made clear that Member States must be able to demonstrate that national security would be compromised in the case at issue. The Court of Justice also held that threats relating to national security are the ones that are capable of seriously destabilizing the fundamental constitutional, political, economic and social structures of a country, such as terrorist activities. Based on the court case law, therefore, Member States cannot merely refer to national security in a general way to exclude the application of EU law. In cases reported by the press, the real issue seems to be whether the use of such a spyware is generally justified by national security in the individual cases at hand. When such a restriction to the right to privacy and personal data protection cannot be justified as falling under national security, EU law must apply with all the requirements it provides. It is also important to bear in mind that where EU law is not applicable, The European Convention on Human Rights still applies, as well as national constitutional law safeguards. Honourable members, the Commission has been gathering information from all the Member States about the national legal frameworks governing the use of spyware in order to examine the interplay with EU data protection law. Most Member States have replied, except the Netherlands and Hungary, and we are following up with Member States whose replies are still outstanding. We are carefully analysing the responses received. This exercise requires putting Member States' responses in the context of their relevant national framework. It is important to consider the following points: whether Member States have in place national legislation framing the use of tools such as spyware for national security purposes, whether the national legislation provides for specific and sufficient safeguards given the high level of intrusiveness of the use of surveillance tools. The report of the PEGA committee highlights the alleged use of spyware against journalists in several Member States. As you may recall, this led the Commission to introduce specific safeguards in the proposal for European Media Freedom Act. We proposed a special provision to further restrict the use of spyware against media service providers and journalists, beyond the restrictions applying to other forms of surveillance. The discussions on this file are ongoing in the European Parliament and in the Council. The proposal for a Cyber Resilience Act tabled by the Commission in September last year also aims to address some of the challenges of supply chain security and to ensure that digital products present on the European market are sufficiently secure. We also acknowledge the concerns regarding media reports about certain Member States exporting spyware to third countries, with authoritarian regimes leading to possible human rights violations. The new dual-use regulation in force since 2021 reinforced the reporting on export of cybersecurity items, including spyware. Still, Member States are in charge of granting export authorizations. According to the dual-use regulation, Member States are obliged to report individual denials, but not authorizations. Having said that, the Commission continues working with the Member States to obtain their assurance of a proper implementation of EU legislation. Furthermore, in line with the current Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, the EU committed to uphold and advance human rights around the world, online and offline. The European Union position regarding unlawful online surveillance is firm. States should implement legislation and safeguards to protect people from unlawful surveillance, including any arbitrary or mass surveillance that may be carried out by state actors in the cyberspace as well as in the physical world. Any such policies have to be fully in line with international human rights law. So, of course, I will now looking forward to your debate, and again, the Commission will try to see how it's possible to implement the recommendations that you will vote at the end of such a debate. Thank you.
Danke, Herr Kommissar.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Lenners now has the floor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. As chair of the committee, I'm standing here with mixed feelings today. On the one hand, I'm proud of the work that we have done, all these meetings, all these missions, spoken to over 200 interlocutors. It really has been a thorough investigation. I also congratulate the rapporteur and all the shadows on the excellent result. On the other hand, the findings of our committee, the facts that we've uncovered, paint a very troubling picture about the abuse of spyware in our European Union. And this spyware is a very invasive, very problematic piece of technology that can be a powerful tool to fight criminals, to fight terrorists, but if it's used in the wrong way, by governments with different intentions, it is a huge risk for rule of law and democracy, both at the national and the European level. And this is why we need to address this and regulate this urgently. And some of the recommendations in the report I would like to highlight. First, spyware should always be subject to an effective judicial authorization and independent supervision. Instead of banning spyware, we should really make sure that member states adhere to certain requirements in using it, like investigating and resolving all cases where alleged abuse of spyware is relevant. Prove that the spyware framework, the regulatory framework, is in line with the standards of the Venice Commission and the case law of the European Court of Justice. Cooperate with Europol during these investigations and repeal all export licenses that breach the dual-use regulation. In addition, when invoking national security grounds, as you also mentioned, Commissioner, there must be a justification. Member States should demonstrate compliance with EU law, including the principles of proportionality, necessity, legality and legitimacy. Now, Commission, dear empty chair of the Council, I'm convinced that we have done our job, and we look to you now to take this further. And we'll be closely watching you while you do so. One last point, President, if you allow me a personal note. I was informed that last weekend I featured prominently on Polish state television, and it's even insinuated that I had direct links with Putin. Now, this is outrageous, and it shows two things. The Polish government will stop at nothing to divert attention from its attempt to abolish rule of law in Poland, and it means that our work has effect. Our measures that we propose are so scary for the Polish government that they resort to this kind of poisonous tactics. So let's make sure this only emboldens us to keep our work of scrutiny even stronger in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hannes Haider next. Thank you, Chair, Commissioner. When the PEGA Committee of Inquiry started its work 14 months back, we could hardly have gauged the extent to which there was unwarranted eavesdropping and surveillance of politicians, journalists, lawyers and politically committed people. We could not have predicted the extent of the use of PEGA. The use of this software and similar software in these instances served to intimidate and silence critical actors from the fields of politics and civil society. Not all of these unacceptable shenanigans have had light shed on them, and these goings-on are an existential threat for democracy in the EU. With our recommendations to the Commission and the Member States, we wish to create the basis for calling a stop to the unwarranted use of spyware in Europe. Such software should only be used to fight serious crime subject to a judge's warrant. The Commission must act comprehensively and present a legal act for the legal use, purchase, acquisition and passing on of spyware, and must also establish common baseline standards. Our ex-colleague Nikos Androulakis was spied upon by the Greek government under the guise of national security. This incident really does go to show that we require a uniform definition of the concept of national security to prevent willy-nilly construal of what national security means. We require protective measures for particularly vulnerable professional groups such as journalists. We need transparency, legal aid for targeted people and obligatory documentation to trace the use of spyware. Affairs of national security are in the purview of member states. Fair enough, but it is up to the EU to ensure and stand up for fundamental rights which all member states have committed to pursuant to the treaties. The implementation of our recommendations is a sine qua non step to rekindle the trust of European citizens in our democracy and rule of law.
Das Wort gebeten hat.
Next up, Rosa Thun und Hohenstein.
Microphone for the speaker.
Does it? Oh. Once again.
To sprawozdanie I zalecenia Komisji.
Thank you very much. This report and the recommendations of the Committee of Inquiry take up more than 200 pages, and it is the distillation of months of long work. We had more than 30 official meetings. We had fact-finding visits in 6 countries. We listened to more than 200 people. Mrs. Intveld has done a colossal job together with the Committee of Inquiry, an analysis, an action plan, but it's also an alarm bell that we want to sound vis-à-vis the governments. The human rights situation and human rights has become a cyber weapon against its own citizens. This is what they used in order to get to power, stay in power. They set up a mechanism that would ensure impunity, but these individuals not remain unpunished. I would like to thank the journalists and activists that all contributed information in order to shed light on this scandal and make sure that it saw the light of day. We have a set of actions enshrined here in the report and recommendations to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And, Commissioner, there will be legislative elections in Poland this year, and I would like to appeal to you, Commissioner. You need to implement one of the proposals, this European lab. The European lab will be responsible for checking the situation and making sure whether online or social networks, communication channels, lawyers, journalists, politicians aren't spied on using spyware. We have to make sure that during the next electoral campaign, the government doesn't use Pegasus or other such tools in order to spy on the opposition. Thank you.
Please, come on. You have the floor, is yours.
Commissioner Reinders, dear colleagues, and too bad the Council isn't here once more because my speech actually primarily addresses Member States, but I'm sure they will receive the message. If one of your best journalists is spied upon while investigating a major story, if one of your state prosecutors is spied upon while preparing court cases, if your defense minister is spied upon while attending NATO meetings, if one of your companies is exporting spyware to a war zone, if any of this happens and you are only a halfway decent government with some responsibility, you would investigate. You would turn everything upside down, find the loopholes that make this possible, bring perpetrators to justice, apologize to victims, right? And I don't get why none of this happens. So basically we, the PEGA Inquiry Committee, did your job in the last 12 months. Yet rather than working with us, Member States' governments ignored or obstructed our work. The approach was omerta, not cooperation. And looking at this mess, I'm quite amazed by what we have achieved here. And I want to thank the rapporteur, the shadows, all members for that, because we managed to come forward with an accurate description of the abuse that is happening and with very solid and reasonable recommendation on how to fix it, supported across party lines by members, by colleagues from 27 EU member states. And if you ever wondered what the European Parliament is good for this. Europe has been a pioneer in protecting the privacy of its citizens and has set standards that have become global ones by now. We bent the entire internet ecosystem towards better protection and respect of individuals' data rights. Yet on something as horribly destructive as spyware, it looks as if we are lagging behind. But dear colleagues, if we want to see European and yes, universal values reflected in the regulation of these invasive technologies, it is time to stand up to the shady practices of secret services and to companies and their CEOs gone wrong, because otherwise the next chapter of surveillance and manipulation, then involving AI and other powerful technologies, will be very, very dark. We have done our job, Commissioner. Now it's time that you do yours. the Commission and the Council. And believe me, we will follow up and follow up and follow up until our recommendations are put in place.
Danke.
Thanks very much. Next up, Dominik Tarczynski.
Panie Przewodniczący, Panie Komisarzu.
President, Commissioner, I thought we would have a debate on the use of the technology in member states of the EU. But once again, we are talking purely and simply about Poland. Right from the get-go, the Commission levelled an assault on my country, Poland. And I will have to fly the flag and stand up for my government and my country. The Commissioner said that the selling to third countries by member states was a scandal. He said it was a practice which should not occur. But what happens? Fin Fisher. This programme, Fin Fisher, who's that manufactured by? By Germany, in Munich specifically. And we've heard the accusations levelled at us by the Commission. Once again, we did not manufacture this type of programme. Poland did not sell these programmes to Morocco. The programme was sold to Morocco by France, but Poland is getting the stick for this. We know all about the various indicators of GDP, the countries welcoming migrants and so on and so forth. We have a low GDP, so we are one of the weakest member states in the EU. We are under constant attack. Long live Poland.
Speaker is Monsieur Gilles Le Breton.
Chers collègues,
Ladies and gentlemen, the decision to set up a parliamentary committee of inquiry on the use of spyware in Europe was a sound idea. I supported it because I believe that the Europeans have the right to know to what extent they've been spied upon and who did it and how. I truly believed that this committee would be successful. I put myself forward as a member, and I even put myself forward as a coordinator for my group. However, today I must admit that the results are disappointing. Of course, the report lists the different cases of spying in Europe, and that's no mean feat, but I'd like to draw your attention to several problems. First of all, the organization of the fact-finding visits. We used the D'Hondt rule in order to select members. That meant that I couldn't go and no other ID members could go to Greece or Cyprus. This is unacceptable because it's biased, and I think that democracy is part and parcel of the credibility linked to a committee of inquiry. And then, of course, there was a huge temptation to settle accounts with certain governments, especially the Hungarian and Polish governments. A lack of impartiality calls into question the findings, most of which are exact. And then, of course, there's an attack against the concept of national security, which is used as a reason for the use of spyware in order to fight against terrorism. I believe that national security should stay within the remit of the member states. I don't think that there should be something within the purview of the EU. We are also underestimating the need of member states to use spyware, especially to fight against terrorism and organized crime. The use of spyware can make sure that other cases such as Samuel Paty's do not happen again. There is a suggestion for a moratorium, even though it's not called that, and I think that this recommendation is flawed. The Committee of Inquiry wants to persuade the member states to vote in laws and make sure there are safeguards that protect us against the abuse of this, and some countries such as France have already done that, and this is a lofty objective, but that doesn't mean there should be a moratorium. By way of conclusion, the Committee of Inquiry disappoints us because of its lack of prudence and objectivity. Thank you.
Next up, Cornelia Ernst.
Ja, zunächst herzlich.
First of all, congratulations to the rapporteur, who has done a good piece of work, because despite the blockage of the member states, the committee could find that Poland, Hungary, Spain, Greece have used such spyware, and Cyprus is involved in trade in the single market. We know that 14 member states have used Pegasus under the guise of national security and finding terrorism a disgrace for democracy. The findings are important for all victims whose rights have been infringed. The use of Pegasus is not can't be reconciled with fundamental rights. So a call for a ban on such spyware and a strong message to all the victims and all citizens. Dear friends, it's about the Commission drawing the consequences for the member states who are using this spyware. And this is a draft piece of legislation on the strict use of spyware as called for by the US committee. I call on you to act, finally.
Next up, Carlos Puigdemont.
Dankeschön, Herr President. Dear colleagues, I want to start by thanking the great work of the rapporteurs of Intervelt and the chairman of the committee, Jeroen Lenaers, for taking on an extremely difficult responsibility. The Pegasus scandal is not about IT, nor security, nor regulation of the radioelectric space. It is a scandal that strikes at the heart of our democracy. And the measures we will pass will not guarantee its protection for two fundamental reasons. First, states are the main responsible of this scandal, and one needs to have a very good faith to assume that the violators of fundamental rights themselves will be the ones responsible for preventing future violations. And second, Pegasus technology is incompatible with the rule of law. A technology that is designed to escape all reliable and independent control opens Pandora's box. And what is to come will not be pleasant. All of you should get ready to see how this technology will be used to influence your political decisions if this has not happened already in cases such as the Spanish position on the Western Sahara. Thank you very much.
Danke.
Thank you. Vladimir Bilčík.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner, colleagues. It was a privilege to work on this report, which I believe is already becoming an important reference document when it comes to dealing with gross misuse of spyware. We must strike a healthy balance between security on the one hand and protection of fundamental rights on the other hand. Sophisticated spyware industry is a relatively new phenomenon, and Europe must adapt to it. We need clear rules and safeguards to protect our citizens, journalists, politicians, and activists. We also must be aware that this technology can help us fight serious crime and enhance our safety. We cannot simply stop technological progress. Instead, we must keep up and deal with technological vulnerabilities and expose those who do not play fair. We need clear rules for legitimate use of spyware, and we have to improve fundamentally our existing checks and balances and judicial practice in line with new technology. This is the main conclusion of our recommendation. And when it comes to misuse of spyware, colleagues, rule of law and legitimate use of modern technology must always go hand in hand. We must, for instance, learn real lessons from last elections in Poland and ensure free and fair campaign without misuse of invasive spyware this year. And we must stand by all victims of misuse of spyware in Europe, especially in countries with weakening democratic institutions and lacking checks and balances. And Mr. Commissioner, we count on the Commission to really work with us on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up, Vice President Katharina Barley.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident.
President, Commissioner, colleagues, thank you very much for your question. For reasons of national security, unfortunately, we can't give you any information. That was basically the standard answer of the member states and their governments to our questions on the use of spyware. Of course, despite that, we dug and we got the information from other sources, in particular from journalists and NGOs. What we found out was shocking. Several governments have used this spyware to spy on various persons, persons, civil society, journalists, prosecutors. I was on a mission in Poland. We were with a prosecutor who was investigating and a lawyer, a politician, a trade unionist. In Greece, we spoke with the chair of the largest opposition party and journalists who were also conducting investigations. These people are supposed to have threatened national security. What they were actually doing was investigating critically. This report gives recommendations, but what we need above all is a legal framework. It can't be the case that we have rules for everything, for what type of plugs and adapters we have, but how no rules on how these devices are spied on. It's not the person themselves, it's their families, it's their colleagues also. It's the entire, all the contacts that they have and the people they know. We have no definitions of national security and we don't have any rules, and we urgently need to change that.
Moritz Körner, the floor is yours.
Moritz Körner. Microphone for the speaker, please. President, dear colleagues, what we have on our mobiles, what do we look at, what we scroll through, what private messages we write. We're talking here about very personal pieces of data. But what if this mobile is subject to hacking by Pegasus spying software, so that somebody can read everything you do on your mobile? Opposition, politicians and journalists in Europe have suffered this. This surveillance is a scandal for Europe. In the Committee of Inquiry, in recent months, we've done intensive work to shed light on all of this. We've done a lot of work. We've done a lot of research in the Committee of Inquiry. But the member states have not played ball whatsoever, and that's not acceptable. Let's make this plain. In our recommendations, we say we need clear rules on spying software in Europe. We call upon member states and the Commission to act for good.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Saskia Brückmont.
Il y a presque 2 ans.
Almost 2 years ago, the Forbidden Stories Amnesty International Citizen Lab revelations on the illegal use of Pegasus type spyware triggered the work of our Committee of Inquiry. We spent hundreds of hours listening to experts and victims. We organized fact-finding missions. We had technical and political negotiations. And our Committee of Inquiry put forward solid recommendations to ensure that such scandals didn't occur again. Unfortunately, our recommendations are not binding, and I regret this, but they follow up what the journalists have said, and they're a key stage in holding people accountable. And now something has to be done about that. We need to have a framework that respects proportionality and necessity, and we need to protect fundamental rights. We have to exclude certain uses, situations, and functions. We have to protect certain professions, and we have to make sure that victims have rights and redress. And there has to be a European Centre of Technological Expertise. And we should also have a moratorium on these in the meantime. When it comes to evidence, not everything is allowed when it comes to surveillance, not even in the name of national security. The use of spyware without any framework or safeguards, without respecting fundamental rights, democracy, and the rule of law have derailed. Lives have been destroyed. And now it is up to the European Commission and the member states to take up our recommendations. And I also encourage the national parliaments to put forward their recommendations. This parliament will breathe down your neck. We are expecting action and and strong text and will be here to scrutinize their implementation. Before we finish our work and the vote in plenary, I would like to pay tribute to the victims of Pegasus and equivalent spywares whose lives have changed forever, and they are still harassed for speaking out, for talking about it, and any suffering and damage that they've had has to be redressed. And I would also like to pay tribute to those journalists and human rights defenders that shed light on this situation and that allowed us to carry out the investigations. You are real lookout posts for human rights, and we have to continue this work, working hand in hand with you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Asita Kanko.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, dear Commissioner, dear President, they say dance like nobody is watching, but text and email like it will be displayed on Instagram someday. Perhaps we should not only see this as a joke, it is serious. Today, not only Big Brother is watching you, but also Little Brother, to censor or to feed disinformation, to influence or to destroy. How can our democracy survive and human rights prevail if the press has lost freedom on the one hand and critical reflex to question things on the other hand? The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the dedicated communist, but the people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true or false, no longer exists. Hannah Arendt wrote this long time ago. In modern Europe, I would call that the perfect recipe to kill a democracy from the inside. Big Brother is not what I worry the most about. French philosopher Raphael Enthoven calls the new threat Little Brother. Little Brother is watching you, so literally anyone can. We can make laws to tackle official espionage. We cannot make laws to create respect in society. To do that, we need to have stronger minds.
Danke. Der nächste Redner.
Thank you. The next speaker is Georg Mayer.
Ja, danke schön, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues. People are curious by nature. That's part and parcel of being human. Our current state of technical development is a double-edged sword. We voted on artificial intelligence, and this is proceeding apace, and we don't know where AI precisely is heading. And it's hard for humans to gauge the precise extent of the surveillance we are subject to. For example, Poland is mentioned 30 times and Hungary 60 times in the report. But the Federal Intelligence Agency in Germany used this software too. I don't think we should have been blind to what's happening in our own backyard. All of this is proceeding at a cracking pace. And this is reality for our citizens in their day-to-day life. We don't want monitoring willy-nilly throughout the EU. There are so many Trojan horses floating around. Even in the EP, we have heard about MEPs having their files stored illegally for 18 months. What is going on with this information, this personal information? Elsewhere, data on MEPs was stored. I'm not levelling accusations at any particular party. This monster, this Leviathan, is prevalent everywhere, colleagues, and we need to keep a keen eye out.
President, Commissioner, I would like to warn journalists, including Cypriot journalists, NGOs, witnesses that shed light on Pegasus and Predator, which triggered this huge transparency operation. I would also like to thank the rapporteur and the chair of the committee, because this has taken pan-European dimensions. We're talking about a European framework that covers our rights, but when it comes to implementing legislation, everything collapses, either because of the use of national security or other issues. Of course, then there's the issue of exporting spyware, and which means that people can rake in money. And I think it doesn't bode well for the future, because if you take into account the fact that the European Commission and the Council ignored us, even worse. When it comes to Cyprus, the recommendations are stringent, and the European institutions and member states have to take all of this into account. After 15 months of hard work, the issue of surveillance isn't going to end when we vote tomorrow. On the contrary, this is only the beginning.
The next
speaker is Mr. Zoido Alvarez.
If we've learned anything over the past year, it's that spyware like Pegasus are very dangerous tools. These are tools which our security services need to use to grapple with threats such as terrorism, drug smuggling and organised crime, or attempts to undermine the constitutional order. But these tools must be used in compliance with what's laid down by the rule of law. This is something which does not happen in countries such as Hungary and Poland, where we've heard about abuses against lawyers, journalists and members of the opposition for party political reasons. Many efforts have been made by the Greek government to step up its legal framework to avoid a repetition of such things in future. In Spain, we broke apart the Catalan independent movement, undermining the Spanish state. Spain is fulfilling all EU-level standards with the appropriate legal checks and balances with rule of law. We've established links between the independence-minded in Spain and Putin. We've called upon the Sanchez government to explain what happened with the bugging of ministers' mobiles. We still don't know what was removed from the Prime Minister's mobile and why. In the EP, we call upon the appropriate authorities to shed light on this.
Excuse me. Do you accept the blue card? Do you accept the blue card? A blue card? No? We don't accept it. Our next speaker is Mr. Ronay Sandor.
Köszönöm szépen. Az Orbán kormány ismét egy...
Thank you very much. The Orban government has shown itself, given a bad image of itself. In this affair, in the Pegasus affair, they've shown that they're not able to recognize the rule of law. So Orban is not getting funds from Europe. The Orban government can't govern inflation on food is 4 times the average in Europe. The Orban government is concentrating, instead of giving proper information to citizens, they're just issuing propaganda with the help of spyware. Citizens, journalists, and business people are being eavesdropped and intimidated. Colleagues, Commissioner, that is the sad lesson that we find in Hungary.
Merci. Il y a un message.
Thank you very much. There's a key message that I would like to put across today. Security, yes, but not at any price. Spyware is necessary in the fight against terrorism and crime, but we also have to make sure that member states don't use national security as a pretext and hide behind that in order to carry out illegal spying on activists, journalists, opposition, and so on. Now, the Committee of Inquiry investigation showed us that we needed two things: better knowledge and development of this technology in Europe in order to protect our citizens, especially if there is a worsening rule of law situation around the world and other threats. But we also need solid safeguards to make sure that human rights are respected at the same time as security. So this isn't the end of a committee's work, but the beginning of what needs to be followed for the European project. Thank you.
Diana, the floor is yours.
Gracias, President, Comisari. Déjame empezar.
I would like to start with the following. My blue card was not accepted. I would remind you that Pegasus can only be used fighting against organised crime and terrorism. In your statement, you classed your net far too wide. As a member of this Committee of Inquiry and also as a grassroots citizen who was spied on, I am fairly satisfied with the recommendations we will be voting on tomorrow. And right now, I would like to stress the sterling and tremendous efforts made by the rapporteur and the chair and by most members of the Committee of Inquiry. We had our work cut out for us. There was political jiggery-pokery going on, protection of national interests and double standards. These were all constants over these months of inquiry. It was disgraceful in the mission to Spain. Spain, the country where there was the greatest number of spying in Europe. It was removed from the purview of the committee thanks to PSOE, PPE and Ciudadanos. They did their level best. But thanks to everybody's consistency, Catalan Gate is at the forefront of this report. A mission was conducted, a mission which many feared, and Spain and Poland and Hungary and Greece and Cyprus were branded as champions in stamping on people's human rights.
Frau Beata Kemper, the floor is yours.
Szanowni Państwo, Komisja...
Ladies and gentlemen, the PEGA committee can't be called a committee of inquiry. To use that name, it must have the corresponding powers, for example, access to secret information. You had no access to many documents. And so the conclusions, to some extent, can be amended. And I have the impression that it was created for a particular reason. For example, against Poland or Hungary. The goal of this committee was never to have an objective goal or to make legislative proposals, because the European Union has no powers here. It was only a political goal against Poland and Hungary, an attack on them. Therefore, there were very controversial witnesses who were asked, persons who are searched by the state prosecutors, who should explain what they're up to. That, against the background of the Ukraine war, there are more important things.
Les peuples européens ne supportent plus.
The European peoples will no longer tolerate meddling in their private lives. In societies where we promise more and more freedom, these specific freedoms are often trampled upon. The list of countries using the Pegasus spyware is horrifying, and the report describes the fact that more than 75 countries have bought this kind of software. On the 30th of May 2021, a Danish newspaper talked about what the NSA had been doing and eavesdropping and spying there. Angela Merkel and others had been spied upon by the United States through Denmark. Did the EU take any measures to protect the EU leaders from US spying? No, it never did. Did the EU come up with a system to protect its economic interest against US predators? No. So then we had, of course, the terrible revelations of Edward Snowden. In 2013, let me remind you that Snowden said that the U.S. was spying on more than 35 leaders around the world. This was recently confirmed by the former French Prime Minister, François Fillon. He appeared before a committee of inquiry in the National Assembly of France, and he said, together with Nicolas Sarkozy, they eavesdropped on me. It was the NSA. The EU always prefers to attack Hungary, Poland, or Morocco. They prefer to do that instead of to defy the United States of America. In a parliament that managed to never deal with U.S. meddling in its special committee on the matter, then nothing surprises me. Yes, member states have to invest to better regulate the private actors that provide more performing tools for surveillance, but there will always be companies somewhere in the world that will provide these services. I'm very sorry to see that the solutions include in giving the European Commission more powers over the member states. The time has come for the member states to make sure that they take over their own national security.
Madame Infeld.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Mariani, I was part of the investigation into the NSA wiretapping, and I share your frustration about the fact that the European Union hasn't done anything about it. Oh.
My English is not perfect, sorry. Oh. I hope I will have French translation.
Okay, right. Okay, so I was saying, I mean, you were frustrated that after the revelations of the NSA spying, etc., that nothing has been done by the European Union. You said, why doesn't the European Union act? But then my question is, why are you, your party and your group opposed to giving the powers to the European Union to act? Because you've tabled amendments and you've, during the debates you have opposed action by the European Union. So are you now reproaching the European Union for being too weak or too strong?
I had not the chance to be member of this committee. How long times I have? Combien de temps? 30 seconds? I have 30 seconds. I wasn't in your committee, sorry, but I think the problem for the European Union is just the weak, because we are strong with the weak people, and weak, we are the strong state. You have a new example. We accuse Poland, Hungary, Morocco, but excuse me, what in the past we did in front of the United States when they listened the people of Europe? Nothing.
Thank you. Is Mr. Stelios Kouloglou.
Monsieur Commissaire, on est...
Commissioner, we're very pleased to see you here, for once, because for a whole year and a half, even though we had scandal after scandal after scandal, the European Commission was completely absent. We didn't get a single statement. And during this time period, we were under attack.
It was attacked like a spy of Russia. Me as an enemy of the people. The Catalans, we have heard them now as enemy of the people. Mrs. Sophie in 't Veld, the rapporteur, was daily attacked by the Greece, by the Greek pro-government media, as Madame Sophie, We attack after attack. We had nothing. Now it's time for the Commission to do its job, and take their recommendations seriously and follow if the member states will implement the recommendations. Thanks.
Danke. Herr Andrzej Halicki, the floor is yours.
Szanowni Państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen, with regard to programs such as Pegasus, in fighting against terrorism, they ought to be used. They are important, but they should not be drawn upon to fight against the political opposition. This is something which has to be swept aside by the European Commission. If not, we will have no due democratic processes and no democratic elections. The scandals already mentioned. The head of the electoral board in Poland was targeted by spyware. His devices were bugged. This should not happen again. There are cases in other member states similar to this. Therefore, we require a directive which applies throughout the EU so that we can have some cast iron guarantee for the security and safety of citizens, as well as electoral freedom. Now, when the state TV station shows certain material, when state channels show a person on their screens, that means this person is very important. So Mr. Leonard's popped up on a Polish TV, so that's a good signal. Ought to be proud of that. You did sterling work. It's an honour.
The next speaker is Mr. Lopez Aguilar.
Herr Präsident. Kommissario Reinders.
Commissioner Reinders, for a whole long year, the Committee of Inquiry on Pegasus worked very hard and came up with conclusions. And what's the point of the conclusions? That the Commission has to take an initiative and come up with European legislation so some issues don't occur again. So the use of spyware in order to blackmail the opposition lawyers, prosecutors, journalists, among others, and the freedom press, that should be banned. We need an export ban to repressive regimes. And we also need to call for a de facto moratorium to cover the export of this, or to revoke export licenses until we get common standards that make sure that there is effective legal redress and judicial review when spyware is used and fundamental rights are violated for any other case apart from the investigation of very serious crimes. And then we need a national security definition and standard so that it cannot be invoked without necessity and proportionality enshrined in the Charter of Fundamental Rights is respected. Thank you very much.
Okay.
The next speaker is Clement Grossel.
The findings of the PEGA committee have shown that despite democracy, no one is immune to misuse of new technologies. If we actually are to believe the Citizen Lab Slovenia is no exception. Of course, we should have technologies that would be used legally because they can help us in our fight against terrorism and organized crime. But despite these benefits, what we need is to prevent any abuse or misuse by private companies or by state actors. So personal data, the most intimate data that are collected via these technologies are not a commodity used by politicians or anyone else. These technologies do not respect state borders. That is why we need uniform norms and standards at the EU level. Also, these standards should be used to punish such abuse. If we don't do that, we will actually live in the novel 1984.
Thank you, Madame Gwendoline.
Thank you. Gwendoline Delbos-Corfield is the next speaker.
De cette commission d'enquête.
We can draw three lessons from the PEGA committee. We need a moratorium and regulations for this new technology. As for arms, these are intrusive devices in the hands of those in power, and they'll suspect for citizens. They are secret, terrifying, ongoing surveillance. Second conclusion, in the EU, states with weak finances have surveilled activists, opponents to silence them. No transparency, no redress for victims. Hungary, Poland, Cyprus, and Spain rich countries like France or Germany don't need to buy Israeli spyware. They can do it themselves. And we know nothing about that.
See.
Thank you. Anna-Sophie Pelletier is the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you to Sophie in 't Veld for her report. 1 year later, we would have liked to come up with a response, but we have a lot of myth and legend. People expect answers. People hope that democracies won't have to deal with this kind of affront. We've got Pegasus and others, and it's given ideas to the French Senate with the adoption of Article 3 of a new law. Now, trampling on our rights has become their dogma, and it is our duty to defend ourselves against this. Is this what we really want for our children? You are their muses. Our lives, their lives are in their interest. Now, we need this kind of counterweight becomes a threat, and yet they are the pillars of our democracy. We have to be careful. These practices are a chronicle of a death foretold because we're talking about the crazy authoritarianism of a handful. Thank you.
Madame Henna Virkkunen, the floor is.
Henna Virkkunen, the next speaker.
Mr. President, Mr. Commissioner, it's extremely worrying development that illegal surveillance has taken place in the EU member states. Certain member states have used Pegasus and equivalent spyware against journalists, politicians, diplomats, lawyers, civil society actors. That is totally unacceptable. That Pegasus committee has been investigating during last year. Unfortunately, it has been often very challenging because it has been very difficult to collect data for the PEGA report from all member states in appropriate manner. Clear rules are needed here. Spyware surveillance should remain the exception and always require effective, binding and meaningful prior juridical authorization by an impartial and independent juridical authority. It must be ensured that the measure is necessary, proportionate and strictly limited to cases affecting national security or involving terrorism or serious crime. We know that technology enables access to all data, also retroactively. Therefore, appropriate limitations and safeguards must be in place. All member state governments and member state parliaments have not provided the European Parliament with meaningful information about their legal frameworks governing the use of spyware. It's imperative that member states now resolve these unclarities that have been discovered during this investigation.
Thank you. Monsieur Thijs-Ruijten, the floor is yours.
Voorzitter, commissaris, collega's. Journalisten in Hongarije.
Commissioner, colleagues. Colleagues in the EP, lawyers in Hungary. There is a whole swathe of people who have been subject to spyware. Spyware used against the people who are conducting their work and standing up for their ideals. We're talking about important people. Spyware is crossing borders. It's disseminated throughout the EU, and that's a threat to our rule of law and democracy. Member states, more often than not, have undermined our inquiry by quoting national security interests. But we're talking about the individual freedoms of EU citizens. We have issued clear recommendations to the Commission. EU member states must protect their citizens and not to spy on them. Thank you very much to the rapporteur, and thank you to the chair of the committee for their sound collaboration.
Strugario, the floor is yours.
The former communist security services in Romania was spying every free voice, spying everyone's private life, including the places where people lived. We had thin walls and neighbors listening in on your conversations. Today in the European Union, we unfortunately have cases in which the authorities are doing the same thing with modern means. This is the most anti-democratic action that a government can take. So congratulations to the rapporteur, Sophie in 't Veld, for her excellent work in her report. We now know exactly how this technology works, but we have recommendations in order to end these practices. Pegasus project has shown that at least 180 journalists have been spied on in the world. Europe can go down a slippery slope if the people who are in the public service and who want to reveal the truth are endangered by this technology. We now have the Media Freedom Act that allows us to act and to implement these recommendations. We have to say that it is forbidden to spy on journalists. They are not obligated to reveal their sources, and we respect them. This is an obvious step that we should take for the safety of journalists and of our democracies.
Solé, the floor is yours.
Deixeu d'espiar-nos.
Stop spying on us. Stop doing it illicitly, illegally, intrusively, and in an anti-democratic spirit. Every time that governments or European state agencies have bugged the mobiles of politicians, activists, journalists or lawyers, they have gradually worn away our democracy and rule of law. Any assault on our phones is an assault on the fundamental rights of everybody. And now I would like to directly address the Spanish state. Stop spying on us and to play ball with the investigations. The victims of your illegal surveillance, we all have the right to know why and how we were spied on, and people must be held to account. It's not just me asking for this. This is also being clamoured for by the European Parliament today, asking Spain to cooperate with the courts. Spain must issue warrants if there are any, and Spain must give a response to all of the victims of Catalan Gate. And you cannot hide behind the pretext of national security. We are not a threat. We are Democrats, Mr. Thoidal. And if we are deemed to be a threat, it's because your concept of democracy is extremely flimsy. And a message also to the extreme right box. None of the extreme right is in the chamber. Stop using paranoid and toxic rhetoric. You're not hoodwinking anybody. The constant undermining efforts of your group will not prevent us calling upon the Spanish state and all the states involved in this scandal to pay reparations. And these states must not repeat this exercise.
Floor is yours.
Pospíšil, please.
Děkuji pěkně, pane předsedající, dámy a pánové.
Thank you, President, ladies and gentlemen. I listened carefully to this debate. I've taken note of the activities of the committee ahead of this debate. I'd like to thank colleagues for their work. I'd like to thank the rapporteur and the chair of the committee, because sometimes it's not the case that the committee of inquiry arrives at clear conclusions and the causes of the problem. It's clear that after the adoption of recommendations of the Commission, it's necessary to have a European reaction. Member states, notably those who are suspected of having abused Pegasus spyware, would like to adopt legislation which prevents it. And that is the case where we must call for European measures, call on the Council and the Commission to carry on the work so that it doesn't end with the recommendations of the Parliament. We need to have very strict rules for legal redress to be effective. We must delimit the reasons for serious crimes where this spyware can be used. If we underestimate the gravity of this question, it could be dangerous in the long term, as has been mentioned in the debate. So I fully support the recommendations by the committee.
Mr. Kohut Lukasz, the floor is yours.
Kaczyński obiecywał w Polsce drugą Bawarię.
Kaczynski promised to make Poland a second Bavaria, but instead of that, we're becoming a second East Germany. He's given the green light to his friends to spy on Polish patriots, senators, President Karnowski, others as well. the Law and Justice Party is treating them as if they were from Al-Qaeda. We're being told that Pegasus is being used for security reasons. How can you talk about security when for 6 months you didn't manage to find the Russian missile? How can we talk about security when you attack Polish generals? What are you talking about? We have an EU. Poland isn't Stasi-land. You cannot gloss over the truth here. You cannot hide the truth. You think that there will be impunity, but you're going to be held accountable in autumn because Poland isn't the Law and Justice Party.
Next up, Jordi Cañas. From Ciudadanos, from the get-go, we've said that the work of the Special Pegasus Committee could be tapped into by people to undermine democracy and rule of law, or could be tapped into by the Penguin to pursue its anti-European strategy. We said there was a risk of Pegasus becoming a Trojan horse, and that some people would open the door to this horse. We avoided this in the report voted through in the committee. This text, which glosses over all woolliness and draws on actual evidence. We have come up with a resolution which will be voted through in the plenary, a resolution containing tangible measures to guarantee the rights and freedoms of European citizens. However, we must emphasise the fact that we must ensure there are guarantees that all member states use all possible mechanisms, all possible tools and all available technology to stand up for our democracies. A state must stand up for its citizens using surveillance techniques, that's only spyware if there is no legal warrant. Thank you. Next up, Marcel Kolaya.
Thank you, President. Dear Commissioner, absent Council. Abuses of spyware to break into mobile phones of opposition, politicians, journalists, activists, but also ordinary citizens. Recording everything the victims do, what they say, who they meet. Gaining access to their videos and photos, email, anything stored on their devices. Your colleagues were speaking about the European Union. We know for sure that there are multiple governments in Europe who acquired these technologies. But where the shock starts is the undeniable evidence that some governments abused spyware to spy on their opponents and seriously undermine the rule of law and the trust of citizens in democracy in their countries. That must stop now. Even though I believe that we need a ban on the use of such technologies, the compromise we reached is a good start and going into a good direction, but our work is not done. The ball is now in the hands of the Commission and the national governments. Please act. Thank you.
Mr. Eugen Tomak, Sie sind unser nächster Redner.
You're next up.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Commissioner, dear colleagues. In less than a year, European citizens will go to the polls again to choose their representatives in the European Parliament. Can the EU guarantee that these elections will be free and legitimate? Because these spyware programs have already proven their efficiency in manipulating electoral processes. The misuse of these programs means more than just an invasion into private life. It is a real threat against the state's security. Let's remember how much harm disinformation and propaganda from Russia have caused. These are very powerful weapons used at a large scale by people who want to silence the opposition, uncomfortable journalists and critics, and trample on liberty and democracy. It's obvious that the European institutions have to do more and have to be braver and more firmer in order to make sure that these weapons are not delivered directly to the hands of the enemies of democracy and freedom of expression. European citizens will go to the polls trusting that their voice will be heard and that the result of their vote will be fair and not manipulated or altered in any way. That is why we need more transparency and safety in order to gain the citizens' trust. Thank you.
Danke.
Thanks. Sylvie Guillaume, over to you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. Tomorrow we'll be voting on the recommendations put forward by the Committee of Inquiry that will help us fight against the illegal use of spyware in Europe. Warm thanks to Sophie and Hannes for all the work done over the last 14 months. We're talking about visits, hearings, often very technical, but extremely informative. And now this has all come to an end. I'm sorry that there isn't an immediate moratorium, even though this report is a solid basis for the rights of European citizens. The set of recommendations put forward are going to have to be fleshed out through legislation because we hear of misuse every day, and this technology is developing in leaps and bounds. Now, the member states mustn't take these recommendations lightly. They have to take specific measures in order to protect the rule of law and democracy. Thanks to the S&D, we are requesting a clear definition of national security as a reason to justify the use of spyware when it is used against journalists, political opponents, others. I think this is an extremely important point. National security should only be used as a last resort with very stringent safeguards.
Ms. Katalin-Che, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioner, dear colleagues. Well, the Pegasus scandal broke 2 years ago, and unfortunately this Parliament is still among the very, very few political voices who refuse to let it be swept under the rug. But we have to confront the reality. EU governments are using military-grade spyware against journalists and critics. Just imagine a reporter trying to work to hold the government accountable. In Hungary, ministers are literally cordoning themselves off and do everything to avoid answering critical questions. And as a thank you, yet again, for the public service the journalists are doing, well, they have their life invaded and their phones tapped. Every intimate detail, every family photo, every private conversation is now subject to the prying eyes and ears of those in power. And colleagues, this is totalitarianism. And we can never ever accept that this is happening today in the European Union. And I thank the rapporteur Sophie in 't Veld for her relentless fight for EU-level action. With this resolution, we demand common standards, clear limitations on targets, and robust legal remedies for the victims. It is the bare minimum for a functioning democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Evelyn Zier, the floor is yours.
Colleagues, it is unbelievable how these spyware programs are being used against innocent people. Imagine a spyware program that in secrecy reads your messages, listens to your phone calls, collects your passwords, follows your every move, have access to your microphone and camera for that sake, and steals information from your phone. Well, since some time back, we know that we do not need to imagine it. The Israeli cyber intelligence firm Pegasus spyware is here and has been used, and that is what the recommendations and the report is very clearly stating. But on what ground the license access is given, to whom it's given, and who it is being used against, we have less knowledge on. Illegal and total groundless surveillance is one of the biggest threats against our democratic European Union. It is therefore unacceptable that Pegasus and other equivalent systems are being used against civil society organizations, oppositions, journalists and dissidents. And unfortunately, I am not surprised that the situation is worse in Hungary and Poland. The situation is alarming to the extent that all of us MEPs were encouraged to check our phones. We need to take total control over these systems to ensure integrity and privacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Bart Grothheis. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Dear Commissioner,
It makes perfect sense that some EU member states use commercial spyware to fulfill legitimate law enforcement requirements. That's not the problem. The real problem, of course, is, like the rapporteur said, that some EU member states use this spyware to discredit the democratic opposition and kill democracy in Europe. Poland, Hungary, Greece, shame on them. And I have a triple call to action to the Commission. First, since it is often the Israeli government signing export licenses for the spyware used to kill democracy in Europe, the EU should exert significant pressure on Jerusalem to halt such exports. Secondly, together with our American friends, the EU should put forward primary and secondary sanctions to entities who sell the rule of law to rule of law violators. Put these companies out of business. And last but not least, let me remind the Commissioner that it was the brilliant Canadian NGO Citizens Lab who disclosed the Pegasus spyware scandal here in Europe in the first place. Where, dear Commissioner, where is its European equivalent to investigate such technical operations? My amendment to the European budget has already created a budget line to create such an institution. It's now up to you to follow up and make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Demetris Papadakis.
Το σκάνδαλο Pegasus.
The Pegasus scandal, the Predator scandal, and the scandals related to other spyware has shown that democracy is being eroded. And of course, it has put the fact that human rights are being violated in the spotlight. Unfortunately, these type of systems weren't only used for national security or in order to fight against terrorism, but also for the surveillance of political opponents, as was the case with the leader of the PASOK party, Nikos Androulakis, and journalists who were just doing their job properly. In Cyprus, we're still waiting for specific answers from the competent national authorities. Oh, were they using the spyware? Who were they spying on? We've been waiting for answers since 2019, but unfortunately there's been a suspicious silence. We all know that the spyware were on the market as if they were just normal consumer goods. What we have to do now is not just to make sure that they can only be marketed under strict conditions, but that member states also punish those who violate democracy.
Thank you. Ivo Christoph.
Mr. Chair, the Pegasus affair has shown that technology corrupts morality and creates opportunities for abuses, opportunities which human nature cannot resist. Spyware is increasingly blurring the boundary between democracies and dictatorships, because the psychology of those in power is the same regardless of the political system. Pegasus invades everyone's privacy and erases the rights and freedoms which our laws proclaim. Our laws protect the individual, and Pegasus destroys the very notion of the individual and turns it into a transparent mass of data that can be abused by those in power and those with a vested interest. Processes that erode democracy exist in a number of EU countries, despite the existence of safeguards. Cases of illegal use are growing at a breakneck pace. That is why I welcome Parliament's recommendations for political and institutional reforms to provide reliable guarantees of our rights. They're part of the battle for the future of our democracies.
HDI system. I have four colleagues who are interested to take the floor. I will start with Madame Ludmila Novak.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor, Chair. Dear Commissioner, dear colleagues, politicians of any colors, of all colors, from all countries, are tempted to gain power or to stay in power also with illegal and inadmissible means. During the PEGA committee, we have also found out that democratically elected governments in democratic member states have been acted completely in a non-democratic fashion while they were actually spying on their citizens. Also, we have been focusing on individual member states, and there was tension, there was incrimination among MEPs coming from different member states, from different political parties within the same member state. This also shows that what we need is a European legal framework and control of member states so that they will actually respect democracy and human rights.
Danke, Herr Berry.
Thank you. Birger Anders, please.
Thank you, President, Commissioner and colleagues. I'd like to congratulate the rapporteur for the extremely thorough work done on revealing the extent and methods of the use of commercial spyware. The report concludes that many of these companies are registered in Ireland without any substantial presence, such as office space or employees. One such spyware company is registered to a company formation specialist at an office in the centre of Dublin. According to the Currency, an online publication, this company sold its spyware to the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, the successor to the genocidal Janjaweed. The Irish Parliament's Justice Committee has agreed to my request that hearings take place on whether it is appropriate that such companies are registered in Ireland. I say this to illustrate that if the Council won't act, national parliaments have a critical role to play to call out the failure to regulate, to protect and safeguard our citizens and our democracy. Thank you.
Danke, Frau Beata Masurek.
Beata Masurek, over to you.
Bardzo dziękuję, Szanowni Państwo.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Commissioner, the PEGA committee should concentrate on risks facing the European Union, and they shouldn't concentrate on others. Here we have the impression that it's just Poland and Hungary who are using this software illegally to act against the opposition. That's not true. There are very good safeguards in Poland, according to the committee, and there is judicial control on all spying activities. So everything is being done legally. Member states should be able to use these technologies because terrorists these days have modern devices and software, and we must be able to defend ourselves against that. It's about the European Union having its own powers.
Mike Wallace.
We welcome the report on the use of Pegasus. It makes for shocking but not surprising reading on the actions of the apartheid state of Israel and their use of Pegasus software as a method of diplomacy, with the report highlighting how the sale of Pegasus software is used as a diplomatic bargaining chip, with countries turning a blind eye to Israel's actions domestically. The report also highlights how numerous EU member states fully engage in the industry. On my own country, Ireland, the report states, Ireland offers favourable fiscal arrangements to a large spyware vendor. If we're serious about strictly regulating the use and trade of spyware, we must first start in our own backyard and ensure that EU member states are prevented from promoting and profiteering of a product that essentially amounts to mass surveillance.
Danke, Herr Kommissar Reinders.
Commissioner Reinders, over to you.
Vielen Dank. Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs les députés.
President, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for this debate, during which a number of important issues have been raised, asking for your requests for the member states. I recognise that the Council has not been invited for this debate. The Commission has been very clear that all attempts by member states to illegally access information is unacceptable if it's confirmed. When it comes to the conduct of the Commission, I'd like to point out I've responded to various invitations to your committee when it comes to the use of Pegasus in Spain or Predator in Greece, which I discussed with the governments on the spot. I asked for information from the member states that member states should supervise and control their security services to make sure that they fully respect fundamental rights, including the protection of personal data, security of journalists, and the freedom of expression.
To all the member states about the legal framework governing the use of spyware in order to examine the interplay with EU data protection law. We ask a series of questions, including the purposes under which spyware is permitted for law enforcement purposes, for national security or other purposes, the relevant safeguards that are applicable when a spyware is used for law enforcement and for national security purposes, with full respect for the principles of proportionality and necessity. It is not a straightforward exercise, given the diversity of the response received. It also requires putting member states' responses in the context of their relevant national framework. We continue to analyse the responses based on the report and recommendation of the PEGA committee, as well as our own fact-gathering exercise. The Commission will decide on the most appropriate way forward to better protect the citizens. Thank you.
Thank
you. We will finish with the rapporteur, Sophie in 't Veld.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, colleagues, for this debate. We have often referred to this scandal as Watergate, the European or Greek or Spanish or Hungarian equivalent of Watergate. Actually, it isn't. It's like this movie called The Lives of Others, which is about the former Eastern European Stasi spying on its citizens, a repressive regime. That is what this is about. And colleagues, do we actually learn from history, or are we doomed to make the same mistakes over and over again? Do we close our eyes and ears until it's too late, and then we have to start all over again with rebuilding democracy? Because we are not immune to authoritarian tendencies simply because we're European. We have to fight for it. And here, Commissioner, I would like to appeal to you. The European Union has to act, and it has to give itself the powers to act, because quite frankly, relying on national authorities for upholding the law, when those very same national authorities are the actual perpetrators, makes absolutely no sense. You know, thank you. I got a bit choked up here. The thing is that you very often put the burden on the shoulders of the individual, saying, yeah, but people, victims can go to court. But then you're putting the burden on the individual, the burden of upholding EU laws. That is not a replacement for enforcement by the EU Commission and the other EU bodies. Then, on national security. National security is very important, but it has become a blanket exemption to the democratic rule of law. It is very important that we get a clear demarcation, whether it is a unified European definition or the obligation for member states to define, but there has to be a definition of national security. Commissioner, this is a full-blown democratic crisis, and therefore we need a crisis response, not a technocratic, legalistic and timid reaction. We need to act as we did in the other crises, as I have said before. Because, Commissioner, this is my last sentence, Chair, not 1,000 democracy action plans can save our democracy if we just stand by and watch how it is being destroyed. There is a broad majority for the recommendations. Please, Commissioner, act on this with all the strength that you have. Thank you.
Danke, Frau Berichterstatterin.
Thank you, Rapporteur. The joint debate is closed. The vote will be held tomorrow. The next item on the agenda is the Council and Commission statements, Make Europe the Place to Invest. And once again, I would like to invite the presidency of the Council, Jessica Roswell, to take the floor.
Thank you, President. Honourable members, Commissioner.